Today, we're testing 25 games on the new Apple M2 chipset. Pause the video now for the specs of my 13-inch MacBook Pro. Before we begin, most of these games have been tested under the macOS Ventura beta. Ventura provides access to the new Metal Performance HUD. This HUD allows you to monitor gameplay performance with real-time stats and logging, including CPU and GPU render time and frame presentation deadlines. I'll be using it for several games in this list. I've included a tutorial in the video description on how to set up Performance HUD on your Apple Silicon Mac. Right now, there are not many modern native AAA games to try on M2. We're still waiting for those Metal 3 games from WWDC, from Resident Evil Village, No Man's Sky, and Grid Legends. While you wait, the RPG Baldur's Gate 3 is kind of the only modern native AAA game to try on M2 or even M1 for that matter. Alvarez and the Apple Metal engineering team have brought support for many advanced features in Baldur's Gate 3. Like a few other macOS games, it supports EDR, Apple's representation of HDR on Mac. Also supported is AMD FSR 1.0 and Metal 2.3. When you first launch the game, it may get mixed performance in some scenes. The main reason for this is because the game requires 10 GB of unified memory, and this 13-inch MacBook Pro has only 8 GB of memory. With some graphical configurations, you can make it playable on M2. Play at 1080p, put VSync to triple buffering and the FPS cap to 30, put the overall preset to medium, and lastly, enable AMD FSR 1.0 for quality mode. Still, running under ARM means the game is at least more playable here in comparison between the original Rosetta build from patch 4 versus the latest patch 7 build. Alvarez told me they are working on lowering the memory requirement, bringing Metal 3 support to the game in the future for Apple Silicon-based Macs, and bringing full controller support and finally touch bar support on MacBook Pro. Even though Apple Silicon Macs have been around for 2 years now, most new AAA games that arrive on Apple Silicon are still running under Rosetta. WARHAMMER 3 is the newest AAA game on Mac and is probably the most demanding game we've seen so far. In fact, it's only available on Apple Silicon-based Macs right now, as it has performance issues on AMD Intel Macs. It runs under Rosetta, but Feral Interactive have optimized it for the M1 architecture with Metal 2.4 and AMD FSR 1.0 support. Feral told me, currently due to certain middleware being Intel only, such as several libraries for online multiplayer, we cannot release a native title. On M2 at 1080p medium, the game gets around 35 FPS on average in battle, and 30.4 FPS in campaign. Enabling AMD FSR 1.0, then putting the render distance to 71%, will provide 53.3 FPS in battle and 47.3 FPS in campaign. This provides a good balance between tolerable visuals combined with more acceptable performance. It's pretty remarkable that I could not get the game to take up more than 7 GB of memory in peak here. Quite a good feat by Feral Interactive. It's worth noting, if you disconnect your charger, an FPS cap of 30 is applied when the hardware cannot draw enough power. Once you reconnect the power source, the FPS should get back to its max value. At WWDC 21, we learned that for Metro Exodus on Apple Silicon, the translation layer 4A and the Metal engineering team were using was optimized for Metal 2. But some issues showed up when two complex systems came together in practice. To help, they had to ship it to Mac with Molten VK. I could not get the Performance HUD to work correctly with this game, so I'm using the external framerate capture software TR-Drop. You can play at 1080p high and will get around 25 to 50 FPS. If you play at 1080p medium, you will get a much higher FPS and it will be a much better experience. This is the mode that I suggest you play at. You could also try playing at 900p high if you'd prefer 60 FPS consistently. The ray tracing version of Metro Exodus isn't supported on Mac, same with HDR. These features have been available with Metal for a few years now and are greatly improved with Metal 3, so hopefully they can be added in a future update. Despite being a few years old now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is still one of my favourite AAA games to play on Mac. It's made even better with HDR support on Mac, or EDR. Feral managed to get this game to almost never take up more than 7GB of memory, which is again a good achievement. Here is 1080p medium settings with 36 FPS on average. If you desperately want to play at high settings, I suggest enabling a half refresh rate. You will get 29 FPS on average, but you'll see less FPS dips towards the low 20s during challenging scenes, which is much better. If you want closer to 60 FPS, you can play at 756p. Borderlands 3 is a very poorly optimized game on macOS.
How disappointing.
It kind of gets the same performance here as it does on M1 Max, which is weird. I think a big reason for this is because it's running on an old version of Metal way back from macOS Sierra. I also could not get it to work with the new Performance HUD, so instead I'm using the external framerate capture software TR-Drop. Here it can play at 1080p medium settings with 33.64 FPS on average. Make sure to put VSync on for a more consistent frame rate and to avoid the awful screen tearing. Minecraft is now officially native on Apple Silicon. This is huge for Mac gaming, as Minecraft is one of the biggest games of all time. To be honest, I don't really know what people want to see in this game, but I've tried my best, okay? Don't be hard on me. With mods installed through Fabric Loader such as Sodium, Iris shaders and FPS display, you can play at 1080p resolution, high graphical settings with over 400 FPS. Amazing! Several shaders work too, and I've listed working shaders for Apple Silicon in the video description. I'm using the most common one, I think, which is Silder's shaders, if that's how you say it. This completely revamps the lighting and adds advanced effects like volumetric lighting, bloom, ambient occlusion, and reflections. You can play at 1080p high graphical settings with up to 80 FPS. As we all know by now, I hope playing Windows games via Boot Camp is not supported on Apple Silicon. One of your options is Parallels 17, which is by far the easiest one to set up. Parallels allows you to run Windows 11 directly under macOS through virtualization and can provide access to Windows games that support up to DirectX 11. Not every game is supported though. I've included a list of compatible games for Parallels 17 from Apple Gaming Wiki in the video description. So as an example, Parallels is not always great for playing recent AAA games, as it shares resources with macOS. FIFA 22 can only really play at 720p low to achieve anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS. I want to say thanks to Andrew Tai for sharing that this game is only playable on Parallels 17 if you assign 3 GB of memory. I strongly suggest checking out his channel to stay up to date with Windows gaming on Apple Silicon and everything else gaming on Apple Silicon. In my opinion, Parallels is ideal for playing 2D games or non-intensive titles. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a beautiful indie game and a good example of what you should play here. Here I'm playing at 1080p balanced with around 60 FPS.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention?
Psst! You can get 10% off Parallel 17 for the next 2 weeks using my coupon code MrMacRight. Don't tell anyone. An alternative to playing AAA Windows games or just any Windows games on M2 is Crossover 21. It translates Windows commands into Mac commands so you can run Windows games as if they were designed native to Mac. In the video description is another list from Apple Gaming Wiki on compatible crossover games on Apple Silicon. It supports up to DirectX 11 games, and Codeweavers are trying to add DirectX 12 support this year. Unfortunately, most recent and complex games that require DirectX 11 often don't work altogether, behave strangely and show inconsistent results with shaders especially, or require a lot of steps to get up and working. And it honestly can be a little bit annoying if you're not a fan of tinkering around with settings and files and all that stuff. If you're desperate to play AAA games, you'll have to play slightly older ones, from around the time 8th gen consoles were released. Codeweavers, who are behind Crossover, have added support for a few games, and this means you don't have to do much to get them up and working. For example, 2014 Racer, Wreckfest, has wonderful performance, getting over 30 FPS at 1080p high. I really hope the dev considers porting Wreckfest to Mac or even iOS, as we don't get many AAA races on Apple platforms these days, and I hope this performance, where the game isn't even running natively, is a good indication that it could run really well if it was ported over.
Oh, shit.
GTA 5, everyone wants to see this game, because, you know, it's still like one of the most popular games out there. But really, it isn't the most challenging game to run anymore on PC because it's fairly old. It sees a 40 to 60 FPS at 1080p normal graphics in single player, and 30 to 40 FPS at 1080p normal in online gameplay. Still, I still can't get over that I'm playing this game on my Mac. I just can never get over it. It's so awesome. I play this game all the time on my PS4 or PS5, I can't remember. And it's just, I don't know, it's cool.
Stop what you're doing and listen!
Psst, don't tell anyone. You can get 15% off Crossover using my coupon code MrMacRight when purchasing a Crossover subscription. Don't tell anyone, it's a secret. macOS Ventura brings back support for racing wheels and pedals on Mac. Feral are one of the few Mac devs that have supported racing wheels for years, since PowerPC based Macs. So this isn't really new tech for Feral or Mac, it's just been reintroduced in the latest OS. Feral told me they will be performing multiple wheel support tests prior to the release of macOS Ventura, but they don't have any official comment at this time. Here, I'm playing Dirt 4 with my Logitech G920 and G driving force shifter, and as you can see, it all works perfectly, but it still doesn't improve my driving I'm not very good. Dirt 4 also plays wonderfully on M2. It's not a demanding game by any means, and it only takes up 70 gigabytes of memory in peak, so yeah, you can play at 1080p Ultra to get 55 to 60 FPS, or 1080p High for 60 FPS on average. Or you can play at 4K High for 30 FPS. I also suggest enabling VSync for this one, as the screen tearing is quite noticeable. Apple M2 is a godsend for playing quality indie titles. Many new indies are fully native too, which means they get great performance. I've put another list from Apple Gaming Wiki in the video description for native Apple Silicon games if you're interested. Myst is considered as an indie experience by Scion. They told me directly. It has amazing photorealistic landscapes. It was the first Mac game to support AMD FSR 1.0, and it's native on Apple Silicon through Unreal Engine 4. It's amazing that it can play at 1080p high graphics with 60 FPS and only requires 4 GB of unified memory. To achieve this, you have to put AMD FSR to quality though. You can even play at 2160p or 4K epic quality with AMD FSR put to performance. 3D indie platformer Psychonauts 2 was ported to Mac in 2022 by Double Fine. This is a big deal, as its publisher is Microsoft. Hopefully this will encourage more ports in the future for Apple Silicon. Based on my testing, the game has no full screen mode, and I couldn't find a way to change the resolution in-game. Which is weird. The in-game resolution changes depending on the native resolution of your Mac's display or external monitor display, or your chosen display resolution under System Preferences. In this instance, I'm playing at a display resolution of 1080p with high settings enabled, and we're receiving around 35 to 60 FPS, and only using upwards of 4 GB of memory in peak. It's acceptable performance, as this game is quite demanding with very challenging 3D scenes and effects. For 60 FPS, just change the settings to medium. Divinity Original Sin 2 is one of the few games to take advantage of the touch bar on MacBook Pros. Here are some other games that support this feature if you're interested. Just like on other MacBook Pros with a touch bar, the OLED strip displays little buttons and icons to replicate the game's F-key functionality. You can swipe horizontally and tap icons to quickly save, switch characters, view your map, inventory, and so on. It's rudimentary, but it does work great for this type of game where it has multiple systems and mechanics. The game also runs great here at 1080p Ultra and 60 FPS, or 1440p Ultra and 30 FPS. The game only requires 6 GB of memory too, which helps with performance. As most of us know, Apple Arcade games are supported on Apple Silicon or Mac in general. In fact, since Apple curate all of these games, you'll find most are now fully native on Apple Silicon. Another benefit of playing high-end Apple Arcade games on Mac is that many offer custom graphic options from different resolutions, graphical presets, and different post-processing effects.
Union City wishes all citizens a happy Aspiration Day.
Beyond a Steel Sky is likely the most demanding Apple Arcade game, requiring up to 4 GB of unified memory, requiring 15 GB of storage, and is all powered by Unreal Engine 4. You can play at 1080p high and get up to 60 FPS. NBA 2K22 Arcade Edition plays very comfortably at max settings, but it also did on M1, 1080p ultra high and 60 FPS, consistently. Even better, the 30 FPS bug during player camera shots is removed on Apple Silicon, Even though OpenGL and OpenCL are deprecated on macOS, games running under this framework still work on Apple Silicon. Alien Isolation runs on OpenGL 4.1 and OpenCL. As you can see, it's up and running here. What you'll find, however, is that almost every game still running under OpenGL and OpenCL have mixed performance on Apple Silicon, and the new Performance HUD doesn't support OpenGL apps too. So I'm using an external framerate capture software TR-drop. Isolation is only able to achieve 30 to 60 FPS at 1080p medium settings. It's not unplayable, but for reference, the game supports Metal on iOS and gets 60 FPS at a high resolution and max settings on the M1 iPad Pro. So it by all means should here if Feral planned to update it to Metal, but they told me they have no such plans. On the other hand, Dying Light was ported to Mac in 2016 by Techland and originally ran on OpenGL. In 2021 it was updated to Metal and now only requires upwards of 7 GB of memory. It has wonderful performance even through Rosetta. It's very playable at 1080p high and 60 FPS, or you can play at 1440p high for 40 to 60 FPS. Dying Light was also recently ported to Nintendo Switch, which also uses an ARM-based architecture. Techland have been great with updating Dying Light on all platforms, so I hope they can make it a native application on Apple Silicon in the not too distant future. But I know they're focusing on Dying Light 2, so while you're at it, bring Dying Light 2 to Mac. Come on, come on. On Apple Silicon Macs only, some iPhone and iPad games are available through the Mac App Store. They are labeled with Designed for iPhone or Designed for iPad. A developer can choose if they want their app to be available on Apple Silicon. Some of the best games to look for are ones designed around single-touch mechanics. Monument Valley 2 is one of my favourite iOS games, and it works wonderfully with your mouse or trackpad to solve the puzzles. But as you can see, the game only supports portrait mode. Some developers, such as That Game Company, have modified their game to support different aspect ratios and resolutions, such as 1080p on this 13-inch MacBook Pro. The game also has full controller support, full keyboard support, and partial mouse support. What you may notice with some games that support mouse input is that the mouse icon doesn't disappear, which is really annoying. Hopefully Apple can work out a fix for this in the future. All these iOS games can run easily at their highest quality with 60 FPS, even on the original M1 chip too. There are many ways to play classic games on M2 that are not supported natively. First, many game source ports from the Mac PowerPC era are coming to Apple Silicon. A great place for these is Mac source ports. One of the most demanding PowerPC Mac games was Doom 3, which used to run on OpenGL. Now it's running on Metal and is native on Apple Silicon. It's really cool to see a game that I used to play on my iMac G5 at a super low resolution and frame rate, now playing at 4K 60 FPS on my M2 Mac. Ether SX2, if that's how you say this application's name, allows you to play PS2 console games on Apple Silicon. It's a weird world we live in sometimes. This is one of my most played PS2 games back in the day, so seeing it running at 4K 60 FPS on an ARM-based Mac with a Switch Pro controller, I don't know man, it's just really bizarre to me. Dolphin is an emulator for two Nintendo video game consoles, the GameCube and the Wii. I didn't spend that much time with this one, but here I am playing Mario Kart Wii at 1440p with anti-aliasing and anti-stropic filtering, if that's how you say it, on their max values with the 60 FPS. Lastly, RPCS3 is a PlayStation 3 emulator, and it now supports Apple Silicon through Molten VK. Here, I'm running Demon's Souls at 1080p with 40 to 60 FPS. I'm sure it can get 60 FPS with some more configuration. Getting games for this software can be a little tricky though. You can download games online, I guess, but that isn't technically legal. Due to legal reasons, PlayStation 3 titles cannot be distributed online and must be self-dumped from your own PlayStation 3 console or from your computer using a compatible Blu-ray drive. So, what do you think of the gaming performance offered by the new Apple M2 chipset? Is M2 a gaming machine? No, not really. M2 has the performance on offer for it, but what's the point of all this power and cool technology on offer if we're missing most of our favourite new games? I hope Apple is behind the scenes trying to encourage more developers to port their games to Apple Silicon, and I hope the general public can see that these machines have potential in the gaming space. Leave a like and a comment if you found this video useful, and subscribe as I hope to put out a video comparing the performance with the original M1 13-inch MacBook Pro. That being said, I've hardly been uploading this year, so maybe don't expect too much from Aussie Professor Severus Snape. Anyway, my real name is Stewie, and thanks for watching.